With an election looming, what does the future of the NBN actually look like?
Vertical Hold is proudly sponsored by NetComm, taking Australian technology to the global market.
Welcome to Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, where we talk to Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the news of the week. I'm Alex Kidman, and I'm not joined this week by Adam Turner. He's on a brief break and already cursing his choice of leave week because it's been a huge one for NBN News. So usually here at Vertical Hold, we describe the NBN as our soup du jour, but this week it might be our soup la semaine, our soup of the week, because there's a lot of news in the NBN space. And I'm joined now by Paul Smith, the technology editor at the Australian Financial Review.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
Big week for NBN News, basically headlined by Labor revealing its election strategy for what it would do with the finished NBN, because we're super close to when the NBN rollout is meant to conclude. And they've got a few interesting ideas up their sleeves, but possibly not what people might have been expecting. Headlined by the idea that they're going to improve the home wiring of a whole bunch of people on fibre to the node. What's that all about?
Oh, well, this is just the fact that we've been for the last 6-7 months, longer even, people signing up for fibre to the node, either getting poor performance by congestion on the network, which was problems with the amount of capacities ISPs bought, but also that they've now recognised that there's also been issues involved with some people's premises, that the houses themselves are getting in the way of allowing the signals to come through properly, and they reckon that they can spend a certain amount of money, it's over 100 million, I think, to get people out to people's premises to fix them and make their performance better. But this taps into the idea of improving existing fibre to the node performance rather than ripping it out and starting again, which is what many people were perhaps unrealistically hoping Labor might say it was going to do, because they've spent the last few years criticising the multi-technology mix, NBN, which is what we've got, largely based on the fact that fibre to the node is not going to be fit for purpose for the long haul, which I personally agree is true. I think it should have been minimised as much as possible. But yeah, so what the new plan from Labor is basically doing is saying, right, we recognise that this is not performing well for anyone. We'll invest a bit more, make it better, fix up the wiring in some people's houses, and then we'll see how we go from there. Which is perhaps a realistic approach, but not hugely different to what the coalition was already doing, and certainly not as dramatic as many people would have liked when they saw the Labor policy going into an election, because it pretty much is steady as she goes, really.
Yeah, I mean, the upgrading the copper sort of makes sense. NBN spent an awful lot on copper, but that's been copper in the street, as it were.
That's right.
Whereas they haven't really looked at the stuff that might have been sitting in people's houses for 50, 60 or more years. And that's something, actually, if you're on fibre to the node right now and you get an installation done, you can actually get at least checked or upgraded. And basically what Labor's saying is, or NBN Co. actually, will cover the cost of that.
Well, look, it's one of those things where, as an outsider looking in, in my house, I'm on fibre to the node as well, and I've had a fairly decent experience with it. No, it's not earth shattering, but it's not really caused me any problems yet. But I know that there's people out there that are getting speeds well below advertised still, despite the improving situation with the amount of CVC that ISPs have bought. So this might help those people, but again, it's kind of polishing things up rather than overhauling it. Yeah, we obviously we'll talk a little bit more about what Labor is proposing to do, but essentially, it's maintaining what's already happening, and then making it a little bit better down the track.
Yeah, well, they've also said that they're going to do a technical and financial review into the NBN. But it feels very similar to me in a way to what the coalition did when they came into power. They said, right, we've got to look at the whole NBN, we've got to look at where it's at and come up with a plan from there. They've at least indicated that they're going to explore more fibre and look at possible different methods for laying out fibre to a small number of properties to gain data on how that transition might happen in the future, which, to be fair, and obviously this does become a bit of a political football, but to be fair, at least is a little bit more than we've heard from either the coalition or even NBN Co.
Well, look, to be fair to both sides of politics, it has been a horribly political conversation rather than a discussion about what is the best for the country. And I think a lot of that is in the court of the coalition. They obviously came into power, saw a chance to change what Labour was doing with the fibre to the premise thing in order to score political points, dressed it up as a cheaper, faster solution, which wouldn't really hamper performance too much. I think history will judge them very poorly for that. But as we stand right in the present, I wrote a column for the AFR this week, which we had a headline on saying Tony Abbott basically won the broadband wars, which caused me a little bit of grief on social media, as I'm sure you'll have experienced, Alex. People like to tell a journalist they're an idiot based on reading the headline. But for people that only did read the headline, I wasn't saying that the coalition elected the right strategy and has therefore been proven right. What I was saying is Tony Abbott wanted Malcolm Turnbull, when he was the communication minister, to destroy Labour's policy advantage in the NBN as it related to how people viewed it. Labour had a much more popular NBN policy than the coalition. And if you look on paper now, 9 years later, 9.5 years later, however long it is, that has been eroded. The arguments about technology now are all going to be historical. Labour can say, look where we are because of what the coalition did. And that, is true, but it's arguing about history. On paper, the two parties now have very, very similar policies. If you look essentially at what Labour's policy is, it's to review and then upgrade bits where appropriate, which is almost the very definition of what the coalition says its multi-technology mix policy is. So continually review new technologies and upgrade where appropriate. Almost identical. As you pointed out, Labour has been much more vociferous about trying to get more fibre to the premise or fibre to the curb into the mix. But it's not exactly the blue sky difference that used to be the case between the two policies. So I don't think anyone voting for future changes to the NBN could really see a huge amount of difference in the policy. But then again, judging by history, you'd have to say Labour has been much more progressive. So it's going to continue to be a political argument, but not really much in the way of political difference in terms of policies on paper at the moment.
Have the Liberals really said that much in detail? I mean, obviously the Labor announcement this week was very kind of top line, not that heavy on the fine detail. But my impression is that the Liberals have said even less beyond just the, oh, yes, we'll look into new technologies, which, frankly, they've been saying for a number of years now.
Yeah, well, I think it'd be quite fair to say that the coalition would be very happy if no one spoke about the NBN at all during the election campaign, because it always turns into this historical and current argument about the fact that they've basically sold the country a lemon. And look, I think it's a fair point to say that the coalition has not optimised what could have been achieved from the National Broadband Network. Labour is in the position of being able to say we were going to do this so much better, we were going to have so much faster speeds, which is all true, but we will never know what could possibly have happened with the rollout. It wasn't going well when they lost power, but it could have been turned around. You can look globally and say FTTP has become cheaper, but we'll never know how well they would have delivered it because, of course, in Australia, we had this unique situation where the most capable companies, as in Telstra and Optus, were on the outer, and NBN Co was using contractors that it could hoover up because of the way that the original deal was struck with the government. So it's a mess. It's a mess, and everyone knows it's a mess. So I think the coalition would be happy if we spoke about other things like demonising electric cars and things like that, instead of what they've done in terms of positioning the country for the future from a technology infrastructure perspective. I mean, the coalition, the day of Labour's policy announcement, they were putting out press releases bragging about 10 years of establishing NBN Co and all the achievements it's made, and they've got the stats that on paper look okay. 75% of Australian premises can now order NBN services. 5 million Australians have taken up an NBN service, and the TIO, Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman, stats, which came out late this week on Thursday morning, I think they came out. They showed that complaints related to NBN services are dropping, so less people are phoning up and complaining about the quality of services. So it kind of plays to the point that they've done just enough for right now for most people. Plenty of people still unhappy, but it's the whole where do we go in the future that really hasn't been addressed. And really, we know that that fiber to the node is going to top out at 100 megabits per second in ideal conditions, whereas what we're talking about with other places around the world and what possible with fiber now, we're talking 1,000 gigabit, and it's going to be a long time before we're realistically going to see most home connections get anywhere approaching to what we're seeing in other countries that have less landmass to cover. I actually had an interesting conversation with another journalist earlier today, and he said to me, "Do you think overall Australia would have been better off if NBN had never existed?" And I couldn't really answer the question. My response was, I think we'd probably have just as fast, if not faster, service in metropolitan areas, but regional areas might be screwed a little bit more than they currently are. But I don't think there's a strong case to say that after 10 years, NBN has actually made the country's infrastructure better, because there's competitive forces in the market may have led us to faster speeds in some areas already. I don't know what you think about that, Alex, but I didn't really have a strong opinion.
I think and I guess, and I was actually going to raise this question with you shortly, but I guess it depends on what you think the NBN is for. If you think I don't disagree that within metropolitan areas, within those areas where the private companies could have seen a profit, they wouldn't have kept pushing stuff forward. And for some large enterprises, obviously, the speeds that NBN is offering, they were able to spend money on 5-10 years ago to get dedicated lines, dedicated fibre, and make it happen anyway. At the same time, it depends on what you think the NBN is for. If you think it's just about faster speeds for individual use, yeah, maybe not. If you think about it as a social or an economic booster, I think there was probably more potential there, which, again, as you said earlier, we perhaps haven't reached. But there was a potential there to both do that kind of regional metropolitan bridging the digital divide and bring other services into play. But this also then plays into the question I was going to ask you, which is how much of this do you think is just kind of everyone treading water while they wait to sell the whole business? Because as soon as they sell it, as soon as it becomes private, it becomes whoever buys NBN Co. Everyone's tipping Telstra, but whoever buys NBN Co.'s problem to deal with that future upgrade path.
Yeah, and the question is who would want to buy it at the moment. I mean, I'm not sure Telstra would. I mean, they've obviously hived off that infrastructure business as a potential future home for the NBN, but I don't know. I think they'd be quite happy to sit on the sidelines at the moment and look at how it's developing and say, okay, show us what it can do, because at the moment it's you're seeing not the 5G. Obviously, I think we've spoken about it before, and I'm sure you have on this show, about the fact that 5G isn't necessarily a straight replacement for fixed line broadband, but for many people, it's going to be good enough for now. So, I mean, it's going to definitely impact. And we've had Optus's CEO, Alan Liu, talking this week about the fact that they should let telcos like Optus and Telstra build their 5G infrastructure into areas that are going to be served only by fibre to the node, almost like contractors, which in a way, if you could just turn back the clock and say, well, could we have just had you guys building it from the start, it would have been a lot better. So look, I don't really know. I think the question about who's going to buy it is very much up in the air. It's certainly not going to be worth as much as was suggested by the chairman not too long ago. But I mean, it really, I mean, that's a question for future. I mean, the big question at the moment from an economic point of view is, does it need to be written off? I mean, the finance minister has constantly said that it's not a case where it could even be written off yet. But the business model of the whole thing is widely accepted in the telecommunications industry to be holding it back in terms of performance. I mean, the demand to make a commercial return versus, whether you see it as a role of a public service providing fast speeds, capacity, opportunities for telehealth, businesses in rural areas. They don't marry up. I mean, it goes back to the very start when it was set up off budget as a non-government business, an investment that was expected to make a return rather than a national infrastructure project, to a nation building, so to speak. And I think, I always come back to the fact that right at the start, they pitched it incorrectly. There was enough support, I think you'd say in hindsight, once the NBN was up and running in its initial form, there was enough public support, despite lots of criticism in the press for what was going on. There was enough public support for it and enough arguments to be made for investing in it from a national infrastructure perspective that it would have been one of those things that would have eventually become bipartisan if they'd pushed through and been stronger at the start, would have eventually become, well, an easy question to ask: do you not want this? Do you not want this higher speeds? Do you not want this better infrastructure?
A broadband Medicare, in essence.
I mean, down the track, it would have been one of those things that people would have said, well, of course we needed that. But obviously that didn't happen. Then to get it up, they had to say that it was going to make this commercial return. That commercial return requirement is looking increasingly difficult under current circumstances. And that obviously impacts, their future sale value as a business, because it doesn't look like a huge money spinner to anyone. And look, I think that this review that Labour is putting in might be a way for them to come back and say, look, you need to write this off and invest more in it. And then that sort of makes it not a political call, because whoever's in charge at the time is going to be accused of losing billions of dollars on the NBN. Someone's going to have to make the call at some point. If Labour wins, it might be them. If the coalition goes back in again, we'll probably just have another steady as she goes period of, underwhelming, worthy progress on it. So it's really underwhelming overall. I don't think there's a huge amount for anyone to be excited about with broadband anymore. But I think that from the coalition's point of view, they've nullified it as a political argument, because Labour's pretty much, I wouldn't say rolled up the white flag, but they've not offered anything particularly different, other than saying, well, it's the coalition that have got us in this mess.
Well, speaking on that kind of commercial return need, we've seen NBN Co really push heavily, and we've talked about this on the show before as well, quite recently, really heavily pushing 50 meg and 100 meg plans at the cost of those entry level, what they now call NBN standard, the 12.1 plans. And the ACCC's weighed in on this as well, giving it another little kind of dimension, saying that essentially the entry level pricing as it currently stands is too high for consumers.
Well, certainly for a large enough percentage of consumers as well. And that's a fair point. I mean, especially when you're talking about needing to remediate people's wiring in their houses to get it performing the same. It's a fact that, it's a nice racket to be in if you can force people onto a service and say, we're switching off the other one, but you need to buy this one. It's going to cost you a bit more, and it's exactly the same standard or less. And that's been the case for enough people that, the ACCC have had to step in and say, come on, sort it out. And obviously the response from NBN Co and the government has been, well, of course we will look into this, and pricing is fair. But the fact that the competition regulators had to step up and say this isn't right when it's kind of obvious that it's not right, just shows the kind of sort of malaise and sort of just general cloud that's hanging over it all, really. It's just another example of, if you look back to the start when we were going to have this big nation building new network that was going to put us at the forefront, have people working from wherever, to now we've got the case of, however many years down the track, people paying more for a lesser quality service. It's just, it's just depressing, really, isn't it?
It is, and I mean the stats the ACCC had were pretty alarming. I mean, it's something like a quarter of all connections are still on those 12.1 speeds, so that's a large number of Australians. But the pricing for an ISP to offer it is almost the same as for them to offer a 50 meg plan. NBN Co at the same time sort of has its hands tied because it's got to do that commercial
Yeah.
return thing. It can't just do what the ISPs have all been crying for, which is basically to drop the CVC price. So I don't even know if it's something that's got an easy solve under the current NBN model.
No, and that's, I mean, people like myself can come up here and say, well, they need to write it down so they don't need to make a return, so then they can drop the CVC prices. But there's nothing to stop the telcos, just pocketing the difference themselves, because I mean, there's nothing to say that they're going to pass on all those savings to their customers. It's easy for them at the moment to play the heroes, but one of the reasons we got into the mess we're currently in is because the telcos didn't want to play ball back when the NBN started. I mean, we all remember, well, we don't all remember, but people of a certain vintage remember when Telstra were asked to bid for their role in building the NBN. Their submission was a couple of pages long. They didn't take it seriously because they were too busy fighting with the minister about whether they should be structurally separated or not. So, I mean, it's easy for now the telcos to come on and sort of say, look, well, NBN needs to do something to help, but they haven't got great form in being consumer facing, and they're good guys in this either. So we'll see where it goes. I mean, it's very clear from whenever you or I or anyone else in our game writes an article about NBN, the anger out there is absolutely obvious. I mean, it's this thing. Well, I read this article this week, and I've had people calling me a coalition stooge for my new boss at Nine, Peter Costello, who clearly cares so much about the NBN that he comes and instructs me to write columns about it, which is obviously a ridiculous suggestion. And other people telling me that I'm exonerating Gillard and Rudd from their part in the mess. Everyone's angry about it. No one's happy with where we're at. And shooting the messenger is one way to, I guess, people let off steam. But I think by and large, there's a huge number of people out there that will judge the coalition very poorly for how it's handled broadband policy, and I think quite rightly.
Look, I reckon if both sides of politics are attacking you as a journalist, you're probably doing something right.
I'm either completely misinformed or I'm a genius. I'll go with option B. Yeah.
Awesome, Paul. Thank you so much for your time.
That's all right. Thanks, Alex.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. And as always, we love to get your feedback on the show. So if you've got a strong opinion on the NBN's future or who's got the best plan for the NBN, let us know via Twitter or the Vertical Hold Facebook page. And we're also on a big push this year to reach as many people as possible. So huge thanks if you've already given us a shout out on social media or left a review. And if you haven't, feel free to do so. Go out there, tell your friends, tell your mum, hit up iTunes or your podcasting platform of choice and leave us a review to help spread the word.
Vertical Hold is proudly sponsored by NetComm, taking Australian technology to the global market.